Okay, welcome everyone. Happy Wednesday. Sitting here with my trusty companion Eli in the back of Tim J. Leary Studios on the first Wednesday of the month. So we're having our first Wednesday art walk outside, and I'm going to do my first Wednesday art talk in here tonight. So please do me a favor and click something so I know you're here. I can see how many people there are, but I haven't figured out how to find out who watches. So, and I'd love to know. So I start like every week, every time with my libation. And Eli's observing as I pour. This is some very special Irish whiskey called Green Spot. And so, cheers, everyone. So, so my topic tonight is very broad, as usual. I like it that way, and I'm going to see how this goes. I was talking to my friend Dawn Marie Forsyth last weekend, and we were talking about beauty. And there's a lot of thought about what is beauty and what makes things beautiful and all that kind of stuff. So I have a starting point. So the thing about beauty is that it brings together not just the art and the visual media, but it's also, there's a spiritual aspect to it. So this book, Divine Beauty, written by a former priest and philosopher from Ireland, who I had the great pleasure of meeting one time. He treats this as a theology, but his writing is so poetic, and his theology is kind of like an earth-based or earth-centered spirituality. So what I want to do is talk about that, of course, but also talk about how this is applied and how long have people been trying to define what beauty is. You know, we say beauty is seen in the eye of the beholder, and that's true. But there's a little more to it than just that. It's not quite that simple. Let's see if I have something wonderful here. Yes. I was with a friend out on Lough Corrib, the largest lake in the west of Ireland. It was a beautiful summer's day. Time had come to rest in the silence and stillness that presided there. The lake slept without a ripple. A gray-blue haze enfolded everything. There was no division anymore between earth and sky, reaching far into the distance. Everything was suffused in a majestic blue light. The mountains of Connemara seemed like pile upon pile of delicate blue. You felt you could almost reach out your hand and pull them toward you. No object protruded anywhere. Trees, stones, fields, and islands had forgotten themselves in the days of the blue. Then, suddenly, a harsh flutter as near as the lake's surface split, and a huge cormorant flew from inside the water and struck up in the air. Its ragged black wings and large awkward shape were like an eruption from the underworld. Against the finely woven blue everywhere, its strange form fluttered and gleamed in absolute black. She had the place to herself. She was the one clear object to be seen, and as if to conceal the source as she soared, she left her shadow thistling the lake's surface. This was an event of pure disclosure, a sudden epiphany from between the worlds. The strange beauty of the cormorant was a counterpoint to the dreamlike delicacy of the lake and the landscape. Sometimes beauty is that unpredictable. A threshold we had never noticed opens. Mystery comes alive around us, and we realize how the earth is full of concealed beauty. St. Augustine expressed this memorably. I asked the earth, I asked the sea and the deeps, among the living animals, the things that creep. I asked the winds that blow, I asked the heavens, the sun, the moon, the stars, and to all things that stand at the door of my flesh. My question was the gaze. I turned to them. Their answer was their beauty. So beauty, by that, is a state of mind. He experienced something beautiful and was awestruck by it in that moment, enough so that he remembered it and was able to write about it. But still, how do we as artists make something beautiful? And there are some formulas involved in that. I don't think I have anything direct about that, but Pythagoras, back in ancient Greece, had a whole spiritual cult, a mystery cult, that revolved around math and geometry. And for him, that was how they discovered and revealed the divine, through math and geometry. And I get that. Geometry is beautiful. Where have I got geometry? Like in here and in here. There were formulas like the golden mean, which is a beautiful proportion, and you actually see this stuff being used on purpose. If you ever notice, if you've never noticed this before, when you're watching a show like 60 Minutes, they'll have someone being interviewed, and they're not usually in the middle of your screen. They're usually off to the side a little bit. Watch this the next time you see an interview. And what that is the golden mean is approximately 1/3, 2/3. It is, and here's where Pythagoras comes in, it's repeated in our anatomy, it's repeated in the world. This proportion here, if I'm remembering this correctly, from the tip of my finger to the wrist is 1/3 the length from the wrist to the elbow. So these proportions are in nature. And so artists often use that. So let me see what kind of examples I found from art. I looked through a couple of wonderful books, and I think I'll start here because I don't remember what I picked out. But there are formulas. Another thing about what makes something beautiful is the use of composition. So composition is not a random thing. I can remember years ago my students would talk about collage and they'd say, oh, it's just random. Well, no, nothing is random in a collage. It's very meticulously laid out and planned out based on those ideas. So one of the first things I learned in doing window displays was how to make arrangements of objects that made it interesting. I wanted to have a focal point in my composition. Each display was a composition. Maybe I need more whiskey. Each display was a composition, and it needed to have all those elements. So it needed to have movement, it needed to have form and shape, and it needed to respect all of those things that made something interesting to look at. So maybe we can talk about what's interesting to look at. Here's something that goes against, I just thought this was gorgeous. These two pieces, they kind of go against, this one kind of goes against what I was thinking about, but not really. In this one, even though there's a curve, and I'll show it here, we have a studio audience, you could draw a triangle over this. And actually, it's not as marked here, but there is a triangle. This figure in the middle is the largest, even though their feet are all pretty much at the same level. And if you use the halo, there is a halo. I don't know if you can see that on the camera. But along with a lot of other features like the colors and the tiles and so forth, are the things that make it beautiful. I saved this because I thought this was a really good example of a focal point. So even though there is a little triangle going on back here, but it's faded and in the distance. But even though all of these figures are pretty much the same height, there is one, because of color, using color, or lack thereof, is brighter, and so your eye goes first to that. That was something I also had to think about in window displays. I wanted my merchandise to be the focal point. I didn't want the window to, I didn't want the merchandise to be incidental. That was my job. I needed to make sure that that was the thing that was noticed. There might be a first and even a second focal point, but things should be arranged so that your eye is directed when you look at the object. And here, another I had, which is also an interesting one to talk about. It's Sunday afternoon at Le Grand Jatte in the Art Institute in Chicago, so I am lucky enough to have seen it in person. It's a remarkable thing. Seurat spent a great deal of time creating each of these figures. I have another book that I've shown it a lot of times, so I didn't bring it tonight, that has some of these studies of these individual figures before we put them together. So when I taught color and design theory, we used to talk about a couple of different formats of balance in design. So there was symmetrical design, asymmetrical design. There was something called all over, which this is perhaps more like an all over design, but this large figure who's off to the side, I find her to be the first thing I notice. And so I believe that that is the intention of the artist. It's not an accident that we see her first. He's made her quite interesting through the silhouette and her bustle in the back, presenting this whole beautiful scene. I think that's all I pulled out of this book. Thank you to David Orris for this book. Also then, since we're in the old book, we can sign. I took this out because I just thought it was so beautiful. I love illuminated manuscripts. And this also uses color more than anything else to create its interest. So it's a page from an illuminated manuscript from England. I was turned on to that with the Book of Kells, where the pictures are painted on the pages. They're marvelous and remarkable things. I think the blue color is just so appealing, and with the gold. But the way the figure's head tips over, it makes you look at that first. The other things around it are part of a story, and part of these were often Bibles that were used for that. And then another thing that I also thought, so I'm picking out all these things that aren't following the thing I was going to talk about, but let's talk about it some more. So this is a crucifixion scene, pretty gruesome. There was a period in history in the Middle Ages where many of these religious things were very gruesome. They weren't necessarily before that. Like around the 12th century in that area, things were more like the last thing we looked at. But then later on, which I think speaks to the culture at the time, but look at how all of this activity and all this action is concentrated at the top. You can't help but look at that first. So the long cross, and then, so I have the wrong glasses on, but I'd say that's the Wailing Mother on the bottom. Or an angel, perhaps, come to save the day. Something a little softer to look at is Jan Vermeer's, one of Jan Vermeer's paintings. I'm told that there are only a few dozen of it. This Dutch artist, he's famous for the girl with the pearl earring. And there's another one that we went to. They're very small, but there are not all that many of them. In this case, he draws your attention to the action in this painting by framing it and isolating the action in the center of the painting. So creating and interest. So I would say that what I'm doing here is talking about beauty and interest being the same thing, in a way. In this one, there is also a triangle where the maid is taller and creates a higher height variation. And in case you hadn't noticed, she's also wearing a white turban. So just in case the viewer hadn't noticed that she was up there, there she is. Isn't that right, Eli? Yes. Okay. All right. So let me see what else I've got from John O'Donohue. What have I got there? I have one in the back that I saved. So I think this quote starts to talk a little bit about what we saw in the Vermeer a moment ago. I can't pronounce the Gaelic, and so I apologize to my Irish friends. I don't want to screw it up. While vulnerability may be the source from which the beauty of a work of art emerges, the work of art itself inevitably has some vulnerability in its form. There is an old Irish proverb, there is no craftsman without a flaw. Though every work of art dreams of being perfect, there is always some flaw, and one rarely meets an artist who is happy with her work. This restless and divine dissatisfaction is imagined by the novelist Herman Brock, who portrays Virgil's dissatisfaction with his Aeneid. He wants to destroy it. I once had the unexpected privilege of spending an afternoon with one of the great poets writing in English, R.S. Thomas. During our conversation, he was talking about his life as a priest among his people and of his love of being outside in the landscape. At one point, he said that if he had been able to stay inside more and remained at his desk, he might have become a great poet. As he was a very serious man, there was no trace of irony or space to counter the claim. But I was amazed that such bleak self-critique could dwell alongside such magnificent and accomplished work. In the end, every artist is haunted by a few central themes. Again and again, they return to the threshold of that disturbance and endeavor to evacuate something new. This is the magnetic draw at the heart of the wound, the secret force of a silent hunger whose infinite longing is to find its unique voice. When the heart of that force finds its true form, a masterpiece emerges. Elaine Scarry says, "The beautiful thing seems, is incomparable, unprecedented, and that sense of being without precedent conveys a sense of the newness or newbornness of the entire world." He's such a poet, man. Such a poet. So, so here's someone who I think both loved his own work and hated his own work. Our dear friend Van Gogh. So I saved this one because I saw this painting and it just blew me away. It's this one here. It's the Potato Eaters. We think of him by what's on that cover, by the bright yellow and oranges that he painted of the sunflowers and of the billiard room and of his room in Arles. But in this case, he paints in all brown tones, and he conveys a remarkable feeling in these people who were the poor people living in poverty in his time and where he was living. And again, his focal point comes from this lamp. The lamp illuminates this face, this woman here. And note that it's not in the middle. It's off to the side. Surely, even though he was a fast painter, I understand. When he did these outdoor scenes, he would do them in a day. when he painted in plein air. That's the tail. I wasn't there, I didn't see it. But here's a case of an overall kind of approach where he painted flowers. Quite different. Colors are quite delicate and beautiful.
Very different.
I'm going to flip to something I hadn't planned on showing, is this one here, which I think is marvelous. And again, this line, which is draws your eye, divides the canvas in an unusual way. But I mean, I forgive him. But it's also not in the middle as well. So the way he creates the composition, there's movement. This line matters. These things happening over here matter. And so the way he lays it out is as important as what his objects are, what his figures are that he's portraying. And I am a big fan of abstract expressionism. A few years ago, 2017, I think, 16 and 17, Palm Springs Art Museum had this exhibit, Women of Abstract Expressionism. During the period of time when these women were painting, which would be the 50s and 60s, they were told, and all the men agreed, that they were not as good as the men. There might have been one or two exceptions, but all of this happened in New York. So the thing that's interesting to me is all these artists knew one another. They had affairs, they married one another, they drank together, they hung out together, their work influenced one another. And so sometimes, like Elaine de Kooning was married to the famous artist, and so they all think, oh, well, it's because she's married to him, then her art's okay because she's observing and copying him. So this exhibit was about breaking that down. So I picked out a couple that I thought illustrated a sense of composition, because at first, like my students at FITM, they would say it's just random, but it's not. It's an intentional composition. There may not be intentional figures and forms, but the colors in the composition are there, which actually is somewhat like what I've done with paintings like this one, the white one. Even though they're, blobs on the canvas, they, to me, represent the mountains of the desert and look like that. So intentional compositions. That page just opened, but I think, who's the artist here? This is Elaine de Kooning, probably painting her husband over here.
Card game.
Helen Frankenthaler is one of my favorites of this group. She may be the one who got recognition at the time. Even though she was married to an art critic, and there were people who thought that the art critic was telling her what to do in her artwork. It doesn't fit with the other stories about her being difficult, but she's credited with a soak stain technique, which is like that, where there's no gesso, there's no undercoat on the canvas. She created a technique for the paint to act like a dye and soak into the fibers of the canvas. So she actually made a big impact on art. And I saved this one, Ethel Schwabacher, whose work I'm not as familiar with, but I saved it because you can see her intentional composition in here. And in these kinds of paintings, you'll look at them and say, oh, I think I see a this or a that. I remember a New Yorker cartoon of two women standing in front of a big painting, one saying to the other, oh, I think I see a bunny rabbit. But I met a docent from LA one time who said, there are no dinosaurs in the Jackson Pollock paintings. Ain't it the truth? Ain't it the truth? So am I running out of time? Okay. Well, so I was going to talk about and I'll skip to it. I was going to talk about Kandinsky because, as John O'Donoghue reminded me, there's something here, should I say? Yeah. That there's something that you keep going back to. And this is the thing, this work of Kandinsky is stuff that keeps me going back to that stuff. I don't know, it's all out in the gallery tonight. It's not in here anymore. But the things that I found beautiful, I find this beautiful. It's earlier, 1907, earlier than what I typically look at, but I like this one because it's a picture. And it's a picture, and that's a surprise because I don't think Kandinsky made pictures, but of course he made pictures. He made this instead. This is the stuff that I keep going back to. Something like that. There is an influence by that. I love these pieces. There's so much movement. There's so much life. Somebody has taken these to YouTube and created videos of the forms floating in space, eventually coming together into the painting. They're very beautiful. But I'm like, but that's not his painting. But then in the end, of course, it is his painting. But again, triangles and heights and focal points. This one's really obviously has a focal point. I think it's up here, but also where you come down at the bottom has like a secondary focal point to that. So, okay. So if I'm running out of time, I think that beauty is in how we experience what we're seeing. So when I go to a museum, it's like going to church for me because I get inspired, I get awe-inspired when I see beautiful work of another artist, and it gets my juices flowing and all of that, and I experience a sense of beauty when I look at that. Someone else might look at the same piece, in fact certainly people do, and don't see that at all. So then in that sense, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I think that even though we can create things that make the world beautiful, it's kind of subjective. And there are, Pythagoras was right, there are formulas to that. And I can say, as a last note, that Kandinsky's famous for a book he wrote concerning the spiritual in art that he published in 1911. So he saw this also as a spiritual endeavor, as did Mark Rothko, who painted large blocks of color that if you see them in person, they're stunning. In photographs, not as much, but in person, he painted layer and layers and layers and layers of color on top of one another, and you can see it around the edges of the shapes. And it was a spiritual endeavor for him. And there is a chapel in Houston, the Rothko Chapel, that is a chapel of all of his paintings. It's only his paintings in this chapel. And so these works, these abstract works, bring the beauty onto a spiritual level as well. So if you're in Palm Springs, come on down. We're at Back Street, South Cherokee Way, off 111 near the Mercedes dealer and the estate sale. And I hope to see you. And if not, say hello, leave a message, and I'll see you next time. Good night.